Oh, good evening, everyone. Can you hear me well? Can you hear me well? Everybody? Okay. Well, we'll get this conference started. As you can see, we're talking about murders tonight, and you'll be surprised by the number of murders and the people who did them. Committed those murders, and everything else that goes with it. So it'll be quite interesting. The reason I got involved in the murders was because when I was a young boy, my dad used to tell me, oh, you see over there in that field there, that's where Mar got killed and Farrell got hanged and all that stuff. And I'm going, I was 5, 6 years old, and I just interpreted that as being they lynched him and they hung him down that tree or something, which was not the case. But that got my interest in the whole situation. And over the years, I heard stories, and they're all right or wrong or partly right. So I figured I'd set the record straight and try and get as much correct information out there as possible. So we'll get started. So before we get started, Brian mentioned that the municipality of Fossambault, Seigneurie de Fossambault, had several names. St. Patrick's Settlement under Jacques-Cartier, Ste-Catherine, St-Catherine-de-la-Jacques-Cartier, and finally Ste-Catherine-de-la-Jacques-Cartier. So that covered a vast, vast area, as you can see down on the last line. Today you would cover Shannon, Lake St Joseph, Fossambault, parts of Val-Bélair, part of Pont-Rouge, part of Lake Sergent, and the Valcartier military base, a huge portion of that. So the pioneers, the Irish pioneers, were in those areas. Okay, the first murder that I found was in the registers of the Curé Casgrain and in St. Catherine's, and he mentioned that there was a murder in 1832. Don't forget, the Irish arrived in St. Catherine's in 1820. So John Leahy was the first victim. He was born in Ireland and lived in St. Catherine. He was a guy who enjoyed drinking. He was young, and he was a regular client at the Brown Tavern. Married Julia, and then he went on to spend a lot of time at the George Brown Tavern. So George Brown lived on the 4th Range on Jacques-Cartier Boulevard in St. Catherine, well, Shannon, St. Catherine, at the limit. And he lived alone, and he had a shaban. He probably had a shed or something in his house where people stopped to have a drink. He wasn't very rich, as you can see. And he operated a drinking establishment. So we have the Crown Attorney here with Exhibit A, Shillelagh. And so the altercation took place in his little tavern. And he didn't want to serve him any more drinks. And John Leahy got upset. They got into a fight. And the bartender, George Brown, hit him with a stick and knocked him out. And a few hours later, he was dead. So, as you can see, that didn't stop from having many, many places where people have something to drink or create their own little inns and taverns. So he went to jail. George Brown, the coroner. Now, as I can hear, the coroner killing a man. And in 1832, he was discharged, habeas corpus, and I'm sure Brian can help me with that, but you can't keep someone in jail without a trial. So he was liberated. But then, here comes George Brown with the sheriff and the Crown Attorney, and back in jail, guilty of manslaughter. 1 year common jail and branded. Now, branding was like whipping. It was like a form of torture. So he was condemned to that. And here we go, the branding torture in the hand. That's the way it worked. So as soon as you were told by the judge that you were going to be branded, they took you in the back room and they branded you right away. That was the way it was done in those days. Center of the hand, and he had to say, "God save the king," 3 times. Until he had said it 3 times, they would not remove the hot iron. So he either had a T for theft or an M for murder. And that's where it came, when you see people go to court and they raise their right hand, well, the judge could see if you already had a brand. So that's where it came from. So Mr. Brown is pardoned by Lord Elmer. Isn't that surprising? So he's released. Bye-bye. He's gone. End of story. Okay, so we have Mr. James Ferrier here from Montreal, who was a merchant at that time. Before he became the mayor of Montreal and a senator and everything else, he was just a merchant. And Mr. Ferrier wants to get Mr. Brown's farm, his land, his land. So he owes money to Mr. Ferrier, George Brown, and Mr. Ferrier is not happy about that. So he's in 36. He decides that he's going to take his land and pay himself with. Now, why would Mr. Ferrier be owed money by George Brown, a simple farmer? Well, most probably because he was getting all his supplies from Montreal. It's illegal. So he wasn't going to get them from Quebec City, where he would be known to having illegal, probably a still or something of that nature. So he was probably buying his supplies. And Mr. Ferrier was a well-known person in Montreal, and eventually, well, as you can see, he became a senator. Then we have Mr. L'Honorable Antoine Duchesneau looking for George Brown, and we're in 1872. They're looking for him, still looking for him. Now, why they're looking for him? Probably because he owes money to the Seigneur, because but there's no trace of George Brown after that. He's gone. Oh. Yeah, so that was the end of that for Mr. Brown.
Where does he go?
We don't know. We don't know where he went. Nobody knows. I couldn't find him. Parliament of Canada, the interesting thing about this is that Seigneur Duchesneau wanted a police law to be passed so he could open an establishment in Fossambault. And that would be sort of like a workhouse prison. People worked to pay their debts. And unfortunately for him, it didn't work. It didn't happen. It was rejected. Okay, we have the St. Vallier Street murder. Now, the St. Vallier Street murder is in Quebec City, but the people involved are all from St. Catherine. So the only picture I could find image was the Zifferin Paquette's store, which was right next to the inn where the murder happened. And Zifferin Paquette's employee was sitting right there, and he saw it all happen, right? They were like 10 yards away. So that was the second store, Zifferin Paquette. The first one he moved, the second, that was a brick one. And that store, Zifferin Paquette, became the Compagnie Paquette in Quebec City. Yeah. So he started off, his wife had a haberdashery. He had cows, he had dairy cows. And she said, I'm making more money with my store than you're making with your cows. So finally he started to become a merchant. Patrick Pearl. Now, next to the Zifferin Paquettes, he was a son of Patrick Pearl, Margaret Taffy, Ta. The way it's said is Ta, that's the way it's called. It's not Taffy. Everybody says Taffy, but it isn't. And there was a bridge named Taffy in St. Catherine that goes to Place Germain. 6 feet tall, happy person, quiet temperament, no problem. He was a carter. He traveled all night to come to Quebec with his horse and cart. And he stopped over at, he was going to go to the McCallum Brewery, right next to the market. So the McCallum Brewery, this is St. Paul Street here. And this is Daniel McCallum's brewery, and he was going. Basically, the market was around here, St. Paul's Market. So what happened? Meehan went to Lawler's Inn, and Lawler's were from St. Catherine's, and he owned the inn, and he's running that with his mom, and Patrick Pearl was sleeping on the couch, and Meehan came in. He says, I want to deliver a package to your dad. Well, he says, my dad's already at the market. So he says, I have to talk to you. He says, why don't you go up and come out on the sidewalk and we'll have a little discussion. So they went on the sidewalk, and that's when Meehan attacked him, right on the sidewalk. He jumped on him. His friend, James Crody, was in the carriage. He jumped out with his whip, and he hit the Patrick Pearl. And he shouted, strike him, Meehan, I'm at your back. So we know that from the court records. And of course, Pearl collapsed. They started to kick him and stomp him, and he was in pretty bad shape. Mrs. Lawler, the mom of the owner of the inn, and her friend Mrs. Ledman came out. And Mrs. Lawler went after Meehan and grabbed him by the arm and had a little tussle with him and took Patrick Pearl into the inn. And Meehan was still angry. He wanted to get into the inn and continue his fighting with Pearl. And you got to understand that Meehan and Pearl were cousins. And we don't know why he wanted to beat him up and do that. So they fled by carriage, and Meehan came back, and 30 minutes later, he was behind the house, behind the inn. But Crody was nowhere to be found. He took off. So Patrick Pearl was buried in St. Catherine in the old cemetery. And that's the first church in St. Catherine's. There were 3 churches. This is the first one. And the priest used to live up here and had problems with a lot of rodents because that's where they put all the flour and the grain and everything. So it was a bit of an issue. John Meehan. I was surprised to find a photo of John Meehan. And so he was born in St. Catherine. His father was John Meehan, James, and his mother was Catherine Mulcair. And they weren't friendly with the Pearls for some reason. And when the father died, James Meehan died, they sold the land and settled in Quebec City. And John Meehan became a carter and laborer. So he's the guy that attacked Pearl. James Crody, 20-year-old hairdresser. In French, they call him a perruquier. And he lived in Saint Roch, and he was on the run. They were looking for him. They thought he'd gone to the USA. And finally, he was arrested in Charlevoix. They were looking for deserters, and they came upon him, and it was easy to identify because of his full name tattooed on his arm. That was kind of easy. So he was accused of manslaughter. Now, I found a record for Crody. He was the son of William, I know that. But I don't know who his parents were, really. Margaret McKenna, that's what I found in St. Catherine. And William Crody, I found, became a merchant in St. Vallier Street. So there's a good chance it's the same family. And that family moved to the USA later on. But I can't prove that they were the same. So this is just a little aside. James Crody, an apprentice, didn't show up for work. So his master said, okay, you're an apprentice, you don't show up for work? I'll have you arrested. And he had to pay a fine. So that's the type of person he was. He was. So this, to situate the things, first courthouse was built on where that one is right now, that building is, and was there for quite a while and until it was renovated and used currently by the provincial government. So that it's in that building that some of the trials took place. It would look something like that. If you were in court, it would be in the old court, it would be something similar to that. So the Meehan trial, who was the jury? These are the people that were the jury. I put those names up because sometimes people say, oh, that could be my uncle, could be my great-grandfather or great-granduncle or something of that nature. So I think it's important to know who was there. Witnesses. We've got a lot of witnesses to the Meehan thing. A lot of them were workers. There were masons and laborers, and they were working on a sidewalk, working on buildings. The one that's interesting in there is the Napoleon Honoré Leclerc, the priest. He was visiting Quebec. He was visiting. He was walking on a sidewalk, and he saw the murder. So, and he became the vicar in Valcartier, and then he became the parish priest in St. Catherine's, which we'll see later on, because he was there. So this is kind of interesting. So you've got all kinds of names, the Lawlers, the Murphy, Marr, Ledden. Okay, the Meehan trial. Who was there? The judge. This is the judge, Charles Elzéar Mondelais. And the right, George O'Keel Stewart. No relation. There is no photo of John Farrell. Nobody can find one. I don't know why. There's no photo anywhere. So, the verdict, John Meehan found guilty of homicide and willful murder. They wanted to recommend life imprisonment. Lord Monck wouldn't have anything to do with it. So, the penalty was maintained. Now, this is just a little aside, I had to put it in. The British judges wore the cap of death when a person was condemned. Oh my God. So it happened, there's two different ways. Either the court clerk would put the cap of death on the head of the judge, or the judge would simply walk in with it. I mean, that's the guy sitting there. That's not good news. That's not good news. So, and if you look down here, you'll see in Ireland, it was pronounced kibosh. So have you ever heard the pronunciation there? They gave him the kibosh? Well, that's where it came from. So the Quebec jail, Morin Center, that's where the Meehan hanging took place. And if you look here, that's where the balcony was. And that's where they hung Meehan. Oh yeah, by the way, of the prisoners that were in Morin Center in the 1850s and 60s, half of them are Irish origin, and of that half of Irish origin, 80% were Irish Catholics. So there's a lot of things happening in Quebec City. So that would give you an idea what kind of what it would look like, the cell would look like. So Meehan is all alone in the little cell, and the guards are watching him so he won't commit suicide. Hanging is set. The priest, the Reverend Marr, comes to see him. His family comes to see him. And Crody, his friend that ran away, well, he's awaiting trial. He comes to visit. So it's like final goodbyes. After lunch, low mass, last rites. Black flag, the bells are ringing in the church. The sheriff, the mayor and coroner, medical examiners, other people were present. Pat Malloy, vagabond, drunkard, inmate at the prison, was chosen as the executioner in exchange for his freedom. So they brought him in and said, okay, you want to be the executioner? If you do, well, we'll let you go. That's the way it went. Pretty interesting. So this Patrick Malloy, there was a Malloy family in St. Catharines. I don't know, and there was a Patrick Malloy, and there was a son, Patrick Malloy. So I don't know if he was part of that family or if he came from Montreal or somewhere else. But there were Malloys in St. Catherine also. So maybe he was from St. Catherine. I don't know. So they were all dressed in black and cowls, and the hands were blackened. That's the way things were done. So this painting here shows the balcony where they hung Meehan. And this is the main entrance here. So we have a soldier over here. So that's what it looked like. Okay, so they brought him to another room above the main door, close to the balcony, and he walked out, and he stood there. The rope was attached inside through the wall, and there was a deadbolt which served as a release lever. Meehan delivered in a loud and firm voice a remorseful 15-minute speech in English and then in French in front of a silent crowd of 7,000 to 8,000 people. People were on the street, in the trees, in the houses, on the roofs. They were everywhere. They wanted to see this. So he put the rope around his neck, and Meehan took one last look around. White bonnet was put upon his head. And as soon as his hands were tied, the executioner activated the lever, and the condemned man fell to his knees. When the trapdoor opened, the knot in the rope came loose. He lost his bonnet and clung to the end of the rope, shouting, "Oh my God, my God, my God." So he was hanging on to the rope. So the hangman is now twisted under his chin and his feet, and he kicked violently. So he wasn't about to die immediately. So despite his twisting, the hangman just gave him a kick on the knuckles, and away he went. So that's the way it happened. And after 13 minutes of convulsions, it was the last public hanging in Quebec. And Pat Malloy was sentenced to 10 months in jail for vagrancy and drunkenness right away, right after. I guess he was back to his old ways. So this is the burial of Meehan. And he was buried in St. Charles Cemetery, and there were 3,000 people that accompanied the funeral procession. So Crody, when they found him and they put him in jail, and so we have the Honorable Judge Duval here, and John Buckworth Parkin here. He's a defense lawyer. This is the jury. The names O'Connell and Sullivan and Walsh, and some of them are known, some are less known. Witnesses. So some of the witnesses that came to Crody's trial, as you can see, the same people came around, and François Xavier and Octavius and Sewell and Bridget Traynor, the border, and all these people were there, so they were called in. So Mr. Crody went to Kingston and spent his time there, and after that he was sent in exile. Now, most probably to the States. Sometimes they sent it to Australia too. Okay, this one's interesting. This is an aside. If you look at 1852, John Bowles and John McLaughlin beat up Michael Farrell. And the judge says, guilty of assault and battery, and this is the fine that you have to pay. So basically, the sum of £4 and 10 shillings and 8 pence. And if they don't pay, they go to jail for 12 days. Now, the interesting thing here is John Bowles is my second great-grandfather, and John McLaughlin is his brother-in-law. Okay, so I have another murder, Lac Alil. Lac Alil is situated north of Lake St. Joseph. It's in Saint Raymond, basically. But in those days, it was in the Seigneurie de Fossambault. So Lac Alil was where the terminal for the wooden railway was, Quebec Wooden Railway. It went right up the Gosford Road, went right up to the 10th Range, turned on the left, and went to Lac Alil, and there was a mill there. There were other mills, but there was a mill at Lac Alil. So basically, who was the victim? John Davis. His father was considered the first settler in Pine River. And they lived way up in the bush, like 8 kilometers into the wasteland. There was no road, there was a trail. And John was a good worker. He worked for William Crawford, and he was related to William Crawford by marriage, but he kept an eye out on the land. He had been clearing land for Colonel Fitzgerald up in the township of Gosford. Township of Gosford was where Lac Alil, up north. And he asked permission to visit his family and cut firewood. I'm not going to go into all the details, but so he set off, and he disappeared. And there's a long story behind that. And they found him way later. He disappeared in November, and they found him in May. And he was floating in the falls of the Lac Alil. And of course, back of the skull was open and just struck by an axe. Well, he was all alone when he went up there. So Lac Alil, it's 2 parts. The map is in 2 parts because that's the way I photographed it. So this is Lac Alil here. And what you have is the railway come up here. And these are this is where things happen for the cutting wood and everything else in the mill. And this is the second part down here where the falls, and the falls is where they found John Davis's body. So you can see the railway going up here and then up this way. So the first suspect, they had a preliminary inquest. They didn't have a trial, they had a preliminary inquest. And so Edmund Conway was suspected of being involved in this murder. And William Dooley also, he was also suspected of committing the murder. And he liked to drink a lot, and he was quite a character. He lived right here. William Dooley's farm was over here, and Francis Conway was over here. James Conway. So they're all neighbors and close relatives and intermarriage. Preliminary inquest. It was held at the Davis homestead. Conway and Dooley, the evidence was pretty strong. And Dooley had supposedly confessed that he had killed Davis, but later on that was discounted. Dooley admitted that he and Conway were illegally cutting wood on government property at Lac Alil that day. So that's pretty strong evidence. Michael Farrell, this guy, he's always around, eh? So he was a friend of Conway's and Dooley, and but there was no evidence that he'd been around that day at Lac Alil. But they were friends. They were a trio. So who was there at the preliminary inquest? These are people. Most of them were from Valcartier, and like Wolfe, and these are all people living in St. Gabriel de Valcartier, most of them. So what happened after that? So the coroner found human hairs in John Davis's hand. George McCormick, his brother-in-law, saw the hairs, saw the evidence, and he said, those are not John Davis's hairs. They're red hairs, and the only red-haired man around here is Conway. The family pressed for more action, and Conway felt the heat. Supposedly, he tried to commit suicide, and it worked. But before he died, he may have confessed that he and Dooley had killed Davis. The coroner says, accidentally shot himself trying to shoot a hawk. Okay, c'est la vie. But after that, things between the Davis family and Conway families weren't very good. So we have John Davis's record here saying that buried in the 3rd day of May, and it says, been murdered by person or persons unknown in the month of December. So they never found who had done it. The Crooked Birch Tree murder. Now the Crooked Birch Tree. Why the Crooked Birch Tree? Well, there's a story behind that. Who was the victim? David Marr. He was a young man. As a farmer, he was unmarried. And his brother John was married to Michael Farrell's sister. Now, the Farrell name keeps coming up all the time. So he was a victim. And what happened was really terrible. They were returning from Quebec. Now, it was a long story, but I made it short. And they traveled up to Charlebourg, Valcartier. And in those days, you could travel up to Valcartier, cross westward to Shannon, and at the 6th Range. And the 6th Range is not necessarily Wexford Road. The 6th Range was more than that. So we don't know exactly where that road joined with the 6th Range, but probably a little higher up, close to the 7th Range. But again, until I find a map, I won't know. So Michael Farrell was waiting for him. His horse was unattended. And when they arrived, they saw a dark figure there. And so David Marr went up and with his brother, and Mr. Farrell came out and surprised them. So Farrell grabbed the axe and ran towards David Marr. "Come on, you villain, I have you now." And holding the axe with both hands, he struck the victim forcefully 5 times. He split him open, but he wasn't dead. And then he ran away on with his horse, and his brother, David's brother, was there. So John carried his brother for a little distance, and then when he realized that he was dead, he went to Malachi Landegren's farm to get a horse and wagon to bring him to his parents' place. John Farrell, Bridget Farrell, and Auntie Marr were the ones that brought and they were related to Farrell, but they weren't involved in the murder in any way. So we have the Marr trial, where we have the coroner right here, Panet, and he's often mentioned in several cases, and the defense advocate Hearn. It's nice to have photos of people, to see what they look like. So David Marr, according to coroners, dated 1861, came to his death on the 3rd of March. So that's his death certificate, basically. Witnesses at the preliminary hearing for the Marr case. We had John Clear was a close neighbor, farmer. John Farrell was related to Michael Farrell. Michael Grogan, Marr, McDonald, Malloy, tavern owner. And John Sanders, we never knew what John Sanders did, probably a farmer. So the Farrell trial starts, and we have the judge over here, Cullis Meredith, and we have Mr. Farrell, the missing photo. And we have here Marc-Aurèle Plamondon. He was a very, very good lawyer. And as they say, he got a lot of people out of jail and a lot of people out of trouble. And of course, here the Crown, we have George O'Kill Stewart again, and Cairns. The witnesses, as you notice, they're all Irish, if not. Because throughout the day, when they went, they stopped in at one place, Mrs. Malloy's, and they stopped there and they stopped there. People were saying, well, he was in Quebec, he was in Charlebourg, he was in, and the people there that knew what was happening. A lot of Mars and Landers and Those names come up a lot. No more landers in Shannon or St. Catherine. They're all gone. And who was Michael Farrell? Okay, important. In 34, born in St. Catherine by Patrick Farrell and Catherine Murphy. Married to Mary Landers. Surly, vindictive, quarrelsome, and selfish. The slightest annoyance would put him beside himself, and the bloodiest insults, the most terrible threats would be thrown. He was very strong. He weighed 230 pounds and over 6 feet tall. Very strong man. Bald head, and we've got all of these details from the court. It's pretty amazing. And he wasn't a nice person. Okay, Michael Farrell, he's accused. The citizens of St. Catherine were searching for him to lynch him. Oh yeah, they were looking for him to lynch him. Michael Farrell fled to Quebec and was arrested on Rue du Parloir in Old Quebec. He was looking for he was trying to find a lawyer. And he claimed he was attacked by the Marr brothers because of a feud. John Marr had married his sister, so it's a family affair. I think it's like the Hatfields and McCoys or something like that. And John O'Farrell, the defense advocate, and this is straight from the records, seems to have cunningly manipulated and commanded the jury, mostly composed of crimps. Now, crimps were scammers kidnapping people to serve as sailors by coercive techniques such as trickery, intimidation, and violence. So he was a good lawyer. He got the jury on his side. So the verdict, don't forget, he hit him 5 times with an axe. Not guilty of homicide. Self-defense. No accusation, not even assault. And so off he goes. So Farrell goes home. It cost him a lot of money to get the O'Farrell lawyer to defend him, but hey, it was worth it because he got off, which is pretty amazing. So getting back to the David Marr thing, the crooked birch tree. The crooked birch tree was where people in Shannon would drive by or walk by and say, this is where David Marr was murdered. And there was a tree there, there was a birch. So they would identify the spot where the people would stop and say, oh yeah, well that's where David Marr was attacked by Farrell. So that's why it became the crooked birch murder, basically. So the slash fence is a pole fence. When you pull the pole, you go through and you pull the pole back. You must have seen those on farms. So the slash fence murder, how's that go? Francis Conway, the victim, from St. Catharines, and Landers again. We got Conway and Landers, married Guilfoyle, and known as Big Frank. He was on the 6th Range and his farm was there, and he often passed through Farrell's field and let the gate down on the abandoned Gosford Railway. Basically what was happening is the railway was not functioning anymore. It was a wooden railway, so that didn't last too long. But the railway was still there, so Farrell, because his land, you'll see, his land was crossed by the railroad track, had put a fence up so the cattle couldn't get into, his neighbor's cattle couldn't get in. So the crime was, Francis Conway was accompanied by 2 of his young children, Mary and a little boy, his brother Morris Conway, Terence McLaughlin, and William Landers. So they were walking. And Francis and his brother Maurice had passed through the slash gate with the horse and cart and left it down behind them. So then, but that happened very often, and we think that there was some sort of a, like, I'm going to upset you, type of thing. So Francis Conway was scared because he had seen Farrell carrying a rifle. And Farrell had said, don't come back this way. If you do, you will not go back to Rauschenbach to the same tune as you came. That was a threat. Thomas Landers and Malachi Landrigan warned Conway not to return to the area. And Landrigan was Farrell's neighbor. So we have a map here. We have Malachi Landrigan's land here. We have Michael Fitzgerald, and we have Michael Farrell here, Michael Farrell there, Patrick Farrell here. And this is Pine River. So basically the railway came through Michael Farrell's land here, and then through Michael Farrell land here. So he wanted to make sure that the cattle didn't get into his oats and all that stuff. So there was some stuff happening with that. So it's interesting to see where the railway went. And everybody used the railway as a road because there was no road basically. So they walked on the track and they used the wagons on the track too. So they took a short across the field and toward a swamp on Gosford Road. They walked about a mile and then Farrell came out of the bush and shouted, "Go away, go away." And Conway replied, "I will." And as soon as he said that, he shot him in the face, in the head. Point blank range. And don't forget, Francis Conway is with his 10-year-old daughter and his little boy and his brother-in-law, and there's all kinds of people there. So it was quite a traumatic experience. So everybody fled, and Farrell was trying to reload, and he ran for about 4 acres after them. So we know that Farrell was having problems, but so was his brother, Patrick Farrell. He was a ferry operator in Shannon, in St. Catherine, and he had a ferry to cross over. There was no bridge. And people didn't like to have anything to do with Patrick Farrell. So they decided, the hell with Patrick Farrell, we'll get somebody else with a ferry, which Mr. Shanahan. And Mr. Shanahan got fired upon on 3 different occasions by Patrick Farrell, Michael's brother. So they were quite the family. So the police from Quebec came out to arrest Patrick Farrell. And I don't have the details of what happened after that, but we know that Patrick Farrell ended up moving to the United States. He left. So it was a lot of enmity. Okay, so we have a preliminary inquest of Farrell who just shot Francis Conway. And who do we have here? Well, we have a lot of people from St. Catharines, Mars, Donovan's, Cleary, Brennan. We have Pat McGlinnan here. And he's my great-granduncle. And here's Alexander Stewart, my great-great-grandfather. And they were on the jury for the preliminary inquest. So the Farrell trial, we have the judges. There were 2 judges. There was Samuel Cornwallis Monk and Alexander Cross here, and Monk here. And the defense attorney was still absent. We don't have a photo. And James Dunbar here, prosecutor, counsel. The jury. So if you notice, the jury is a lot of francophones. I think that was probably what they intended to do, to make things, there were too many people involved that were related and stuff like that. So the witnesses. So we have O'Connor, Conways, Griffin, Landers, McLaughlin, Towers, Malachi Landergan. This isn't too clear, but the police went to Michael Farrell's home, and they found a large and formidable looking weapon. They also planned to use on a trial at the locality where the tragedy occurred. The bullet with which the murdered man was killed was never found, of course, because it went right through his head. It's probably a 50 caliber type musket ball. Here's the prosecutor with the Exhibit A, the musket that served to kill the Francis Conway. So, the verdict: guilty of premeditated and voluntary manslaughter. So the judge was very distressed about what had happened, and Mary Conway, the daughter, the 10-year-old daughter, had spent 4 days in court listening to everything, and she testified, and she was one of the best witnesses they had. The judge was amazed. They were all amazed that she was so clear-headed. And so the Judge Monk was not happy. Farrell just sat there, didn't do anything, and says, be taken to the common jail, and there within its precincts on the 10th of January, you be hanged according to the provisions of the law by the neck until you are dead, and may the God Almighty have mercy on your soul. So, what did Farrell respond? If Conway had closed the gate, all this wouldn't have happened. So Mary Landers, his wife, petitioned the High Court in Ottawa and tried to get the sentence commuted to life in prison, but that didn't happen. It didn't work. So Mr. Farrell was quite the character. So we have Michael Farrell here with the prosecutor and the sheriff, and he's getting his sentence, and he's being told that he's going to be hanging. So the Quebec jail, on the Plains of Abraham, and this is for people who don't know Quebec City or don't know where these things, this jail is. It was considered obsolete when they built the one in North Saint-Ville, and it was closed in 1970. So, Farrell, impending doom, he's in jail. So he met his spiritual advisors, Father Burke and Wynne. His wife visited several times, but he allowed few visitors, which is strange. He was removed from his cell and sent to a comfortable room in the building. On Thursday, his children bid him farewell, and his wife shared his supper. He showed no grief and spent the night with his spiritual advisors. During the last night, the convict slept soundly, and he attended Mass in the prison chapel. He had breakfast and spent the remaining hours in prayer, I can imagine. Okay, so here we go. Hanging. The nervous young hangman was fully dressed in a black suit. He was young and he was nervous. He clumsily strapped the convict's arms with leather lanyard around his torso and around his legs. Farrell stood upon the drop and only then showed signs of grief and emotion. The executioner pulled the jam lever for about a minute before the trapdoor slowly opened. Having expelled the air from his lungs, Farrell was able to grasp the rope with his hand. It became intertwined with his pinioned arm. So he's not hanging by the neck, he's hanging onto the rope. So this is what it would have looked like. This photo is not from the Quebec prison, but still, it gives you an idea. You've got the hangman here, you've got the convict here, the convicted person, and you've got the priest and the people that are there taking care of business, the sheriff and everybody else, the doctor. So that would have looked pretty much what it was like in the yard in the Quebec prison. So Farrell let out a scream, "Oh my God!" He dangled, and the executioner shook the rope unraveled, and the man fell about a foot. So he's still hanging there. He then descended under the scaffold, and he grabbed Farrell's legs to put some weight. Farrell was tormented and dangled for 15 minutes before he died. Oh, it was a messy affair. He expired in the jail yard, and there was about 200 spectators. And there was a photographer that came in there and took a picture of that. But they wouldn't let him publish it. And he wasn't supposed to be there, but somehow he got in. And the executioner got $30. So this is the sheriff right here. Sheriff Joseph Allen, right here. So this is the image that was in the newspapers. So you have the hangman here, hanging on to Farrell's legs. And they couldn't publish the photo, so they put an image. But the Farrell family and the Farrell friends bought all the newspapers, so nobody could read them. So they went around the city and bought up all the newspapers. And it was a messy affair. So the funeral, so his wife wanted an Irish wake. They said no. We're going to bury him in the yard, or the jail yard. But there's no place in the jail yard. So there was an order in council passed that they will bury him in the St. Patrick's Cemetery, right over here. Then they moved the cemetery from here to the other cemetery, and Farrell's corpse was exhumed and moved to St. Catherine's. So he was buried probably in a common grave. So we have Michael Farrell's church record here, that he was buried in St. Catherine's. Finally. So Mary Landers, Michael Farrell's wife, sold the homestead to Jack Neville. And this is the deed. And it wasn't very expensive, but in those days, $50 was a lot of money. And she moved her family to Cooks County, Illinois. Now, Jack Neville was my dad's godfather. And my dad lived with Jack Neville. So he knew all about the Farrell murder. And this is the Farrell house. I'm sorry? Is it still standing? No, there are no more houses on the base. This is on the military base now. And they destroyed every single house that's there. There's no structures available, none whatsoever. So this is the way it ends for the Irish community in the 19th century. I thank you for being patient and listening to these stories, which are a bit macabre. But I think that historically it's important that we have access to this stuff. So thank you very much.